Hello, my name is Gregory Bratman. I'm Assistant Professor of Nature, Health, and Recreation at the University of Washington, and I'm very pleased to be speaking with you today. So thank you for having me. I'll be talking a bit about mental health and ecosystem services. I want to start with a land acknowledgement. Where I am here at the University of Washington, we acknowledge the Coast Salish people of this land, the land which touches the shared waters of all tribes and bands within the Suquamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations. So, um, what I'm calling nature contact and mental health and ecosystem services approach, I'm here to talk to you a bit about a particular lens on nature and health, as well as discuss some research I've conducted, and then wrap up with a few words about some policy implications for this type of research. And I want to point out that the approach I'll be talking about today is centered around a relationship with nature that does not by any means represent all perspectives or cultural relationships with the land. It's certainly more of a medical model approach, so to speak, and its focus is therefore narrow in many respects. And I feel it's important to explicitly note that this approach leaves out some of the important and critical perspectives that are captured in other work, for example, cultural ecosystem services. And I just want to point to those limitations and note that there's a lot of work to be done in expanding this scope. So I study at the nexus of ecology, psychology, and other health sciences, and I examine the way in which nature experience impacts human well-being with an emphasis on mental health and psychological well-being, including emotion regulation. And when I say emotion regulation throughout here, I basically mean the way people go about changing their emotions unconsciously or consciously. So I'd like to begin with an experiment, since that's what I conduct. And I know we're all not all together in the same room, but I'd like each of us to picture ourselves in this spot and think about how you feel and what's coming to mind for you psychologically. And now picture yourself in this spot and think about how you feel and what's coming to mind for you psychologically. So if we were in a room together, I'd ask you to raise your hands for how many of you there was a difference in how you felt and what you were thinking between these two environments. And I'm going to assume that there are a lot of hands raised. So what I'd like to think about together is why some of us have a different set of thoughts and feelings in these two different contexts. And we'll be talking about the evidence that demonstrates the ways in which natural environments may differ from urban ones with respect to impacts on our well-being, including our psychology. And then I'll move into noting opportunities for integrating this science into ecosystem service approaches. So to start us off, I'd like to offer a simple sort of cartoon about the ways in which Western psychology has considered how humans feel, think, and behave. So if we start with Descartes in the 17th century, the Cartesian approach to the study of psychology, it focuses primarily on the processes of the mind as they exist in ways that are for the most part separate from input or influence from the rest of the body. So this is the idea of a disembodied mind, so to speak, almost a dualism, a digital computational device. And in oversimplified terms, it doesn't matter where the head is. But more recently, with intellectual roots dating back to philosophers of the early 20th century, the idea of embodied cognition has emphasized the ways in which the Cartesian approach was incomplete. So the bodily state can powerfully shape thoughts and feelings, and the mind's not only connected to the body, but the body influences the mind. And the idea here is that our cognition is influenced, or perhaps in some cases even determined by, our experiences in the physical world. It's been summarized as concept activation, which automatically spreads from the sensory experiences to metaphorically related psychological concepts. And then if we push things further outside the boundaries of the head and body, Lewin and others in the post-World War II era demonstrated with social psychology research that powerful forces in the social field can influence how an individual thinks, feels, and behaves. And this work was concerned in part with pressures of conformity, groupthink, and other ways in which social factors influence our well-being and behavior. So now for today, we're going to be thinking about the context in which these processes take place. And we'll be thinking of environment as context. And we'll be focusing on the ways in which nature experience contact exposure it differs from urban experience with respect to its impact on affect or mood and emotion regulation. So some quick background. The world's urbanizing at an unprecedented rate. We recently passed the halfway mark. We're headed towards close to 70% of the world population living in cities by 2050. Concurrent with this urbanization is another trend, a marked decrease in the rate of nature exposure for people living within urban environments. And a third trend, evidence including that some anxiety and mood disorders are on the rise within urban environments, including depression and schizophrenia. Now, the correlation of these three trends does not imply causation, but one way we can start to think about possible connections between them is to consider the repercussions of the environment, especially nature experience, on psychological functioning as exposure to nature becomes increasingly rare. And just a quick side note, I am by no means saying cities are all bad. They provide many opportunities that can be good. We're focusing very specifically on the nature exposure part of things here. And with respect to decreased nature exposure on the population level, for example, in the US, about 80% of our population lives in cities, and we spend more than 90% of our time inside buildings or vehicles. And for those urbanites who do get outdoors, recent studies have shown that a majority of nature contact is experienced by a small proportion of that population. So this study from Southern England, for example, it found that 75% of the total time in nature was experienced by just 32% of the population. So work is now underway across a variety of disciplines to try to understand what the repercussions are of this shift in our daily experience. And of course, when we talk about nature versus urban experience, the environments we exist in today are increasingly a mix of both. Now, the impacts of the natural environment on human well-being, as I kind of open with, this has been considered in a variety of ways for many hundreds, thousands of years, whether it be the ways in which nature is thought of as an aesthetic component of landscape design, or a healing power in hospital gardens, horticultural therapy, or of course, religion and spiritual traditions across the globe. Well, recently, a group of scholars here from the University of Washington and other institutions came together to develop a research agenda on nature contact and human health as it's informed by environmental psychology, public health, and other disciplines, led by our colleague Howard Frumkin. And we published a piece that lays out a research agenda, a couple of areas of which I'll be focusing on specifically today, followed by some results from my own psychology-based work. But broadly speaking, in this paper, we identified 7 research areas at the interface of nature contact and health. I won't have time to drill down into each of these in detail, but just a few words about each domain. So first, mechanistic biomedical studies. So we need studies that help explain how nature contact benefits health. So what are the causal mechanisms at work? And this field has identified many different types of associations between nature contact and human health, but we still have a long way to go to understand how this relationship operates, and specifically for mental health and psychological well-being. And there's likely, of course, more than one mechanism at play across a variety of different effects, but better understanding the mechanisms will help design and deliver benefits more effectively. And several theories have driven research in this field for some time now, a couple that are related to the psychological well-being aspect of things. So attention restoration theory, this posits that our directed attention is overtaxed and depleted in urban environments due to the need to block out distractions in order to focus, and natural environments provide an opportunity for a replenishment of this capacity. Or stress reduction theory, this posits that our common evolutionary past as a species results in natural environments restoring us through an engagement of the parasympathetic nervous system. And there are other very intriguing hypotheses and arguments by Ming Kuo, Michael Moore, and others that enhanced immune function explains many observed benefits, physical activity, clean air, social cohesion. These have all been put forth as mechanisms. So exposure science. Second, we can take cues from methodologies in this science in other realms. For example, the impacts of pollution on health, use those methods and work towards a consistent way to quantify nature contact in health. And as we do that, the methods, they can involve the use of satellite imagery and maps that capture the proximity of residences to green space, or a calculation of the kind of total amount of greenness around a point as a cumulative opportunity metric. And we also need to specify what we mean when we say exposure in each instance. For example, are we talking about visual stimuli or olfactory or auditory experiences? So what's the nature of the interaction with the environment? Third, how do we describe and study the impacts and effects of nature experience using the lens of epidemiology? So how's nature contact associated with specific health outcomes that are of importance to public health? That includes cardiovascular disease, things like cancer, and also mental health, depression, anxiety, well-being, happiness. What forms of nature contact are most beneficial to which types of outcomes? And once we know more about the importance of these benefits, how are we dealing with diversity and equity issues regarding access to nature? How do we incorporate cultural preferences regarding the specificities of contact with nature, such as urban green space and amenities? It's critical to study the ways in which these preferences affect opportunities to engage in contact with nature, and also to look into the characteristics of the effects as well. Is there a way that we can use technological representations of nature to look at A, how do they differ from actual nature, and B, are there ways we can use these within laboratory settings to get at that causal mechanism in a very controlled environment? So here's one we'll be returning to. How do we value these benefits? Can we start to think about the psychological health benefits of nature as a value for society that can be quantified in terms of, say, reduced burden of illness and disease, for example? Again, we'll come back to that. But ecosystem services, as many of us here know, are the benefits that ecosystems and its processes provide for human well-being. And they've been primarily framed in ecology and policy discussions as services stemming from primarily biophysical processes. So water purification, flood protection, carbon sequestration, with the important exception, of course, of cultural ecosystem services. And there may be a way to begin to think of mental health in these terms as well and incorporate psychological ecosystem services into these types of assessments where this element of nature's benefit may go otherwise unaccounted for. So we'll return to this in a bit. Lastly, on the research agenda, if we can arrive at these values, how do we most effectively integrate them into planning and other policy or decision-making contexts? And here, it's important to keep in mind that different kinds of nature impact different people differently, and context matters. So this is just one example of some recent work that just came out in which we showed that individuals with depression and anxiety actually benefit less when feeling social pressure to visit nature. So we have to keep these things in mind, for example, in the context of green prescriptions or advising people to go, implicit versus explicit motivation to visit these spaces. And that's just one of many examples. So getting back to the effects, in terms of just a few of them, I'm going to be talking about some experimental work I've conducted, which fall primarily into the categories related to mental health and psychological well-being. And just a snapshot, and this is from 2012, but the proportions have remained about the same. And the bigger the bubble, the more the studies. So the ways in which nature contact impacts mental health, it's been studied using a broad range of methodologies, from observational and cross-sectional approaches to natural and controlled experiments. And studies have taken place over a range of duration of exposure as well, over the course of minutes to hours to days and years. The types of exposures can range from images on a computer monitor to window views of natural spaces to being present within them. And they also vary across different types of nature, represented by the different colors of the bubbles here. And this is another way of framing this. This is from the 2017 paper that I've been talking about, and it sort of gets at frequency and spatial scale of different types of nature contact as well. If we go back to the bubble chart, we can see there have been many cross-sectional studies with urban green space, focusing on an association of proximity of this green space with reported feelings of well-being. And there's been a fair amount of laboratory studies that examine the impacts of nature versus urban imagery, say, on stress recovery, including that activation of the psychophysiological system. But fewer studies have employed an experimental approach to the effects of presence within nature for duration of minutes to hours. There are more than this 2012 chart indicates now, but there's still a lot more to be done there. And these are the types of studies I've been conducting. So I'm just going to talk us through a couple of my experiments, and then we'll speak broadly about decision-making contexts in which we might begin to apply these and many other types of results in the policy arena. So in a first study we conducted, we tested suburban and urban participants before and after 50-minute walks to which they were randomly assigned, either in nature or in urban environments. And so we had 60 urban and suburban participants who were brought into the lab and tested after these contrasting environmental experiences. And we tested them before and after their walks using self-report measures of affect or mood, emotion regulation, and a test of cognitive function. And then we compared the way in which these assessments changed depending upon the environmental condition. And all were randomly assigned to their condition, so we can attribute the differential impacts between the groups with some degree of certainty to the contrasting environmental experience itself. So the nature condition was a local green space comprising of grassland with scattered oak trees and shrubs, and the urban condition was a busy street with 3 or 4 lanes in each direction. So we found compelling, significant differences in the nature versus the urban group and the ways in which their self-reported mood changed. We found that the nature group showed significant drops in anxiety and negative affect or mood, and comparative increases in positive affect or mood. And every time I say affect, you can equate it to mood for now. So the questions on this are for anxiety, some questions like I feel strained or stressed. Negative, I feel upset, irritable, or sad. And positive includes I feel inspired or determined. Now, as I mentioned, we also assess an aspect of emotion regulation in these participants in order to take a first step into thinking about what one other possible causal mechanism for these mood changes might be. And we assess what changed differently between the two groups with regard to the ways in which participants thought about and controlled their feelings. So people experience a wide range of emotions. It's not just because of things they encounter in life, but also because of the things they call to mind. And some of these tendencies are adaptive. They can help one downregulate negative emotions, others magnify them. So one such potentially magnifying strategy is rumination, and this is a maladaptive strategy. So in simple terms, this involves repetitive thought focused on negative aspects of the self. And it's associated with negative mood, and in some instances, it can be associated with the onset of depression in some individuals. And this is a major part of the disease burden around the world. And I'll call to mind those three major global trends that I brought up in the beginning. So that's why we wanted to dig in on rumination. And to assess it, we asked participants to answer the degree to which certain statements are true about themselves, such as, my attention is often focused on aspects of myself I wish I'd stopped thinking about. Quick side note, separately, within a laboratory context, we've studied what rumination can do to one's physiology. So how those thoughts from the mind can impact the body. And within the context of the lab, we have people ruminate, and we found that many different components of negative mood increase. We've also observed significant impact it can have on physiology. So increases in heart rate, blood pressure, electrodermal activity, the kind of stress response correlate, increased respiratory rate, and decreases in finger temperature. These are all signs of sympathetic nervous system activation, the kind of fight or flight. So it's amazing what your thoughts can do to your body. And within the context of our nature experience study, our results were interesting on this front as well. We observed a decrease in self-reported rumination in the nature versus urban group. And in a separate study, using 38 different participants, we likewise randomly assigned them to the nature versus urban environments, same ones, and we tested them before and after the 90-minute walks, and we observed decreased self-reported rumination in the nature versus urban group as well. In addition to that, we observed decreased blood perfusion in the subgenual prefrontal cortex for the nature walkers. And this is an area of the brain associated with, among other things, ruminative thought. And there's one more interesting effect we found that's relevant here. So as I mentioned, we also measured cognitive function in our participants before and after their nature versus urban walks. This is related a lot to that attention restoration theory. And it's also related to the findings on rumination, because in some cases, rumination, heightened levels of it, has been found to be associated with decreased working memory. So we would expect a decrease in rumination might be associated with increased cognitive performance. So to measure this, we used what's known as the operation span, or the O-span task. And in this test, the participants must memorize a string of letters while at the same time solving math problems. And this is what's known as a dual processing task. So it kind of prohibits rehearsing of the letters during the memorization process because of the requirement to do the math as well. And participants must score above 75% on their math, or their letter scores are thrown away. Sounds confusing. It's hard. It's run on a laptop. It looks a little something like this. True or false? Letter. True or false? Letter. True or false? Letter. True or false? Letter. What are the letters? Well, I can't even test you because I don't know how you performed on the math, but you can tell it's a complicated task. And we observed some interesting results here as well. After accounting for the math performance, the participants in the nature condition remembered on average 10 more letters after their walk, whereas the urban group showed virtually no change whatsoever. And this is out of a total of 75 possible letters, so that change is a significant difference. So not only mood impacts, but also cognitive functions, cognitive function ones as well. So these and other findings are giving us clues about the extent to which the environment may impact different aspects of our psychological processes, though much more needs to be researched when it comes to causal mechanisms here. But I'd like to spend a few minutes thinking through the practical questions. So what do we do with results like these? Well, these findings, coupled with many other studies, employing a variety of methodologies, sample sizes, different participants, they've been building towards a sort of critical mass of evidence regarding the benefits of nature exposure. And this body of evidence sets the stage for some major questions upon which policymakers should be focusing when it comes to nature and psychological health, especially within the context of urban life. So here are just two examples of these decision-making contexts. First, nature in schools. So green space, trees, bushes, other natural elements, there's a vast distribution of how much of this nature occurs within and around school grounds. And science is starting to show that this may have an impact on our children's brains and behavior. A study from 2015 in Barcelona, this recently showed that the more nature there was surrounding within school boundaries, the better the students performed on a working memory test over time. And another recent study found that window views matter for students. So after a mentally fatiguing test, students sat with views of either a wall, a building outside, or grass and trees. And those who had the nature view performed better on a working memory test. And they had decreased signs of stress in their physiology after only 10 minutes. So just a couple examples here, and there are many more, about thinking about nature in schools as an important aspect to consider in the design of our cities. Another example of a context for decision making, we need to focus on equity. So as we continue to show how nature benefits urbanites psychologically, we must address the equal distribution across socioeconomic conditions of access to natural areas. And the picture here is concerning. This is an example from the UK, a population study from 2010, and researchers found that green space availability within a reasonable proximity to one's home decreased rapidly along with income, and the patterns of this go for many nations as well. And here are a couple of other examples from North America illustrated through satellite pictures. So we haven't touched the colors in these pictures at all. They speak for themselves. Income in two neighboring parts of Oakland, highly associated with the amount of greenness near residences. Same goes for these two nearby areas in Vancouver. The need to address this inequitable distribution of accessible nature, it becomes even more pressing when we see that some studies indicate that those from lower socioeconomic situations may benefit even more from exposure to nature. So in just one example here, researchers found that the association with green space and a decrease in bad health was larger for those who are more economically deprived. And we can work with specific populations, such as veterans suffering from PTSD. This is a picture of Joshua Brandon, who's working, doing great work in this space, and using green interventions as guided hikes with a control group in order to engage in the iterative process of testing hypotheses regarding the benefits of nature experience for this population while hopefully helping people in the process. Okay, so these considerations and findings led to an effort and a 2019 paper we made for we wrote for Science Advances, in which we gathered together close to 30 experts in the field, from psychologists to epidemiologists to ecologists, practitioners, leaders of NGOs, to think through some foundational steps of how we might start to model these relationships. So the very first step involved consensus of the authors, and we kind of put forward a series of statements that provided the foundation for the conceptual framework. The first was evidence supports an association between common types of nature experience and increased psychological well-being. The second, evidence supports an association between common types of nature experience and a reduction of risk factors and burden of some types of mental illness. And the third, consensus statement number 3, evidence suggests that opportunities for some types of nature experience are decreasing in quantity and quality for many people around the globe. And this brought us to the formation of a framework for psychological ecosystem services. And the stakes of these are high. So for just one example, the fraction of the total global burden of disease attributed to mental illness has recently been estimated to be as high as 32% of total years lived with disability and 13% of disability adjusted life years. So this is on par with cardiovascular and circulatory diseases. And that's just one example. Of course, well-being is another thing to think about as well, not just the prevention of mental health disorders, but the provision of ability to flourish and feel happiness. So this is the entire framework. We're going to drill down and go through each step in a bit more detail. So first, natural features. So this characterizes the elements of nature potentially influencing mental health and psychological well-being. And it includes size, so total area, composition, proportions of different types of natural elements, and spatial configuration, so degrees of fragmentation and connectivity with other green space of natural landscapes. And other relevant natural attributes can include, say, tree canopy density, vegetation structure, species composition, biodiversity. These can all be put in kind of step 1 of our conceptual framework. The second step assesses exposure. So this is a broad term, of course, and here it refers to the amount of contact that an individual or population has with nature. So this includes residential proximity to nearby green space, cumulative opportunity metrics that we talked on earlier, ability to travel outside city limits to larger areas of nature. And for this, along with other factors, we have to think about spatial configuration and composition. So different shades of green here represent different types of nature. For example, open lawns versus trees, which are embedded within urban surroundings. And the point here is that despite these differences, all panels have the same total amount of nature, 34 street blocks. But the vertical contrasts illustrate differences in configuration, and the horizontal ones illustrate differences in composition. So the model should also eventually account for the sociodemographic, cultural, perceptual, attitudinal, behavioral differences that influence the tendency for seeking out nature exposure. And measurement approaches based on location alone can fail to account for these differences that are due to these factors and include access to transportation corridors, time demands, income disparities, perceived safety. All of this needs to be considered. And the next step will be to consider the types of nature interaction and experience that occur within each nature exposure. So interactions, broadly speaking, Peter Kahn and others have done work to document the different patterns of interactions with nature. A dose is another way of thinking about contact with nature. So these are measurements that move from kind of exposure to absorbed dose that depends on behavior and other considerations. So the way we think about the experience of the nature contact needs to be taken into account, and there are kind of different ways to do that. And then finally, step 4, the effects of nature exposure are also going to vary, say cognitive function, mood, stress reduction, as we've seen. Some will relate to psychological well-being, others will relate to relevant factors to prevent the onset of disease, mental health disorders included, and they will also depend on socioeconomic status, age, gender, other personal characteristics like preferences for nature, and of course, importantly, the ways in which people feel welcomed or discriminated against while in natural environments, some striking and disturbing examples of which we've recently seen throughout our nation. And if we look at these different groups, again, conceptual here, we can see different changes from the nature experience. Not all good, right? If we pay careful attention, say to group B, in the change in stress, we can see in some cases increased stress can occur. So with this framework, tying this all up now, we can imagine potential practical applications as the evidence base builds. This is just one hypothetical application of the conceptual model that we kind of went through in the paper, and this involved antidepressant prescriptions. So we kind of went through, in this case, it was street tree density in a residential neighborhood for step 2. The experience was unspecified in the paper, and we just laid out these kind of conceptual differences of effects in antidepressant prescriptions within this population, depending upon other characteristics. So now, valuation, which comes up, of course, in the ecosystem services approach, it need not always be in monetary terms. So, of course, there are other ways to consider benefits in reducing burden of disease or improving happiness and well-being. And even economic metrics, though, show promise for accounting for these services. So a recent example is the one in which the relative value of mental health benefits was calculated to be 7% of the total economic benefits of London parks. And it's important to note the limitations of the evidence base today, as I've kind of said throughout, as well as the capacity and opportunity to integrate this existing evidence into predictions using a conceptual model. So we're not quite there yet. We need to find more about causal mechanisms and the ways in which these effects and experiences differ across different people. But despite these limitations, we believe there's a strong need for this type of conceptual model and for building it out. Planners and practitioners, they're increasingly demanding the ability to account for the co-benefits of green infrastructure and other kind of urban planning choices related to the incorporation of green space in cities or increasing access to wilderness and big nature areas outside of them. And the repercussions of these choices on mental health and psychological well-being can add up to be quite significant on a population level, and is needed for consideration and integration in decision-making today that will have an influence, we think, in the years to come. And with these effects in mind, decision makers can decide how best to bring additional nature to people even within cities by expanding parks or bringing people to already existing urban nature by increasing access or encouraging and removing barriers to visitation of nearby nature outside city limits. And given the emerging evidence space for the benefits of nature contact, greater effort should be made to increase access to nature to help address the significant health inequities that people from low opportunity neighborhoods experience in contrast to their privileged counterparts. We think the research has advanced enough that we can say with some degree of certainty that in most cases, nature experience benefits mood, emotion regulation, and cognitive function for urbanites and suburbanites. And rapid change and degradation of natural landscapes across the globe provides a critical context for the application of this knowledge. In this way, we can recognize our natural systems as vital assets, account for the central roles these assets play in supporting human psychological well-being, and routinely incorporate these values into decision making. And this will be critical for us to consider as we think about how to bring people to nature. And as we progress the science, we'll get better and better at quantifying the benefits of these interventions on psychological health. So I just want to acknowledge uh, these individuals and institutions and groups that have helped my thinking for the past decade. And thank you for having me today.